Like a cyclone, imperialism spins across the globe. Militarism crushes people and sucks their blood like a vampire, which is a perfect description of imperialism courtesy of Carl Liebknecht. This is Unit 4, Part 1, and then the following video, Part 2 of European Imperialism between the time frame of 1850s to 1914, that year being World War I. Now understand, imperialism will continue after 1914, but in terms of units, that's what we're talking about right now. So let's just clarify quick, old versus new imperialism. You learned last year about old imperialism in 9th grade. This is Age of Exploration, Mercantilism, Christopher Columbus. This is when Great Britain established the 13 colonies, future United States. So that's the old imperialism. That's Spain conquering Central and South America. This unit is new imperialism. This is a direct result of the Industrial Revolution for two main reasons. One was a need for natural resources, and second was a need for trading markets. So it was all about the factories we talked about last unit. European nations like Great Britain, France, Germany, they need natural resources. You can't grow cotton in Europe, but the textile industry is one of the biggest industries in Europe. There's only so much timber you can go in Great Britain. You need to get that from other sources. And then as factories are making all these products, you need customers. So by establishing empires, you're creating forceful trading empires. And I mean, if you look at the world in 1900, it was a world of either you conquered or you were conquered. And this map's actually a little inaccurate. South America, for example, is pretty thoroughly under the supervision, I say that with air quotes, mind you, of the United States. They're still independent, but they're not really. China as well, we're going to talk about next section, is also under the thumb of multiple European and American and Japanese influence, and Japan isn't even showing up on this map, who's starting to establish an empire of itself. So, what were the causes of imperialism? The first one was nationalism, to promote superiority. We've talked about nationalism before. It's the idea of unifying as a nation, and nationalism is where you start to dictate that you believe you are the superior nation above all others. And this ties to militarism, nations with many colonies that provides them power and security. Also economic nationalism. Countries needed raw materials, new markets, again, Industrial Revolution. There's also this social Darwinist survival of the fittest, and that really was a substantial mentality during this time period. So social Darwinism, the idea is that individuals compete naturally. Think Darwin, that links back to Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution. Theory of evolution being that the strong species survive and the weak species are whittled out. Social Darwinism takes that science idea and applies it to society. So again, it takes the idea that the weak always lose and the strong always win. This mentality of survival of the fittest becomes a phrase that people love to use. So besides being applied to science, social Darwinism is applied to business owners. So going back to Unit 3, laissez-faire versus government regulations. If you were a business owner, you would say the government must not interfere unless the unfit are stealing from the fit. Use Walmart for an example. Walmart would say they are a monster of a company, a monster of a corporation, because they're the best. If you don't want them to be as strong as they are, create a better industry. It also applies to competing countries and imperialism. We are the superior nation, and warfare is how we prove our strength. A lot of nations start to view war as almost like a game. Like it's like the Super Bowl, and you need to win to prove you're the best nation of all time. Another cause of imperialism was this mentality of the white man's burden. And so we analyzed this poem in class already. The white man's burden was this idea that there was a moral duty of Europeans, or the white man in quotes, as you will, to teach or civilize nations with Western ideas, bring them democracy, bring them capitalism, bring them customs such as how to dress in proper languages, bring them Christianity. That's ethnocentrism, if you will. That's the idea that it's a superior ethnicity to all others. And it's based on the famous poem by Rudyard Kipling. And so again, white man's burden, it's that mentality that it is our obligation to civilize the world. Other immediate causes: raw materials, Africa and Asia, new markets, debt of African nations to Europeans. There's a lot of forceful calling in debts, international rivalries, superior industrialization. I mean, it's the superior weapons and industrialization that one of the biggest causes. So let's talk Africa. First, the division of Africa. It really starts with the Berlin Conference. It was a meeting held by 14 European powers who are trying to decide, how do we divide Africa? And their goal was to lay down rules for Africa. It's describing all of this as almost like a game between European nations. So the way the Berlin Conference worked was it said any European nation could claim any up for grabs area of Africa by, one, declaring to other European nations that they claim this, and they need to show that they can control the area, that they have a military presence there, that they can establish order, that they're establishing a localized government that can run it. And this sets off the scramble for Africa. Every European imperialistic nation is rushing to get their piece of Africa. Remember, Africa is a giant continent. I feel like if you look at a map, it doesn't do it service. You can easily, for the 48 United States, fit 3 of them in Africa, no problem. The key thing with the Berlin Conference is it showed zero respect for Africans' ethnicities or tribal boundaries. Where different sections of Africa were drawn and marked off, paid no attention to what languages they spoke, what cultures they were, the former kingdoms that used to be there. These were purely arbitrary and random breakups depending on which European country conquered what land. The significance: these divisions will tear tribes and kingdoms apart over the next 80 years before revolutions ended colonial rule. You have a perfect example of today, of Sudan just split into the North and South Sudan because culturally it wasn't supposed to be the same country, but they were created as a country by the Europeans. This happened to Rwanda. This happens in South Africa. This happens all around Africa, where countries exist politically, where the people within it don't consider themselves part of the same nation. So specific motivations for Africa: raw materials, gold and silver, rubber, diamonds, copper, salt, and obviously a trade market. The Europeans purchase cheap raw goods from Africa, and they sell back expensive manufactured goods back to the large African population. And so the famous political cartoon of the division of Africa, you can see, this is Otto von Bismarck, and it's Thanksgiving, if you will. Africa is literally a pie, and they're cutting up pieces of the pie, and the key thing is 0 African nations were sitting at this Thanksgiving table. It was just European nations deciding amongst themselves, what are we going to do with this continent that is ours now. And if you look at Africa in 1914, right before World War II, besides Ethiopia and Liberia, all of Africa has been claimed. Great Britain has a connection all the way from Egypt down to South Africa. France has most of West Africa. Germany has little pockets. Belgium famously has the Congo, which we'll talk about in a second. We've talked about in class. Every European nation had its little corner of Africa, some more than others. The key thing is Africa did not have, the Africans did not have their own sections of Africa. The Belgian Congo we've talked about. It is arguably the worst experience of imperialism on the receiving end. The famous quote from a Belgian officer: "The baskets of severed hands set down at the feet of the European post commanders became the symbol of the Congo Free State. The collection of hands became an end in itself. Forced public soldiers brought them to the station in place of rubber. They even went out to harvest them, the hands, instead of rubber. They, the hands, became a form of currency. They came to be used to make up for the shortfalls in rubber quotas, to replace the people who were demanded for the forced labor gangs. And the forced public soldiers were paid their bonuses on the basis of how many hands they collected." You can see right here, and the Belgians are not the only nations, it's a priority is being made in this conquered territory. We care about the resources, then we care about resources, then we care about resources, and way, way down the list is actual lives of the people who are living there. So the British Empire is often represented with Cecil Rhodes, a British statesman who was instrumental in establishing British dominance in southern Africa. He's famous for founding the De Beers Mining Company, which would control 90% of the world's diamond population. Became Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, which is now South Africa, in 1890. And his master plan was the Cape to Cairo Railroad. So he wanted to, so you have the British territory that connects all the way from Egypt down to South Africa, and he established a railroad line all the way down. Now, this does benefit the African nations absolutely with advanced transportation, and it helps them industrialize. But this, let me be clear, was specifically for the British to gain wealth from the area. Any benefit for the African nations was purely a byproduct, but there certainly was benefits to it. Africa resistance, you have the famous Zulu resistance led by Shaka Zulu, a local South African tribe who attempted to resist British colonialism, but with lack of industrialization technology obviously fails. And you have the Boer Wars, which was the Dutch Boers who used to live in South Africa, and they're fighting with the British who are trying to take over South Africa. And the brutal fightings ends in a truce between the British and the Boers, the Dutch Boers, but at an absolute expense of the native Africans. And the significance is it creates a legacy of distrust and hatred between the groups, which are going to lead to apartheid, which is forced racial segregation, but we'll talk about that later. Now we're going to bounce over and talk for a couple minutes about India. So India is almost exclusively Great Britain who's doing the conquering. What were they looking for? They were looking for cotton. They needed that for their textiles. Indigo is used to dye textiles. They're looking for coffee, and they also were there for opium, but not for the British, and we'll talk about that next section. And again, a trade market, a place to buy goods cheap and sell them expensive to make money, just for the Europeans. So the British East India Company, this was fascinating, where the British East India Company was a business. It's like Walmart, if you will, but they operated like a government that at one point ran 3/5 of India. They were taking power as the old Mughal Empire was rapidly declining. A lot of India is still independent, but it's a weird, the British East India Company they had territory in India. I mean, imagine if Walmart literally just owned, like, okay, we now own the states of New York, Vermont, and New Hampshire. This is now the territory of Walmart. So from 1757 to 1858, the British East India Company was the leading power in India. It was a nation ran by a business. And they had their own army, led by British officers and staffed by Indian soldiers called the Sepoys. So eventually the Sepoys will rebel. And there's a bunch of reasons why they fought back. There were social, economic, political grievances. They hated the debt. They hated the corruption caused by the British. The Hindu and Muslim population, they didn't like the idea of Christian imperialists running their lives. And there was just the obvious, you didn't want another nation telling you what to do. The spark of the mutiny, though, was there was a rumor of pig fat grease used to grease rifle cartridges. So you have cartridges right here that are put into the muskets, and in order to load it, you had to rip off the top, and you had to use your teeth in order to do that. Now, if pig fat was used to grease these, as a devout Hindu and Muslim, which makes up the population of India, that's taboo. That is forbidden. You are not allowed to consume any pig product whatsoever. And these Sepoy soldiers found out that the bullets they had been loading, they had been consuming pig fat grease while doing this, so they fought back. The British respond, they did not tolerate this insurrection. They respond by killing the Indian people and destroying any town that supported the rebels. The retaliation by the British was brutal. And the after effects were arguably just as bad. When the company ran India, it seemed weird, but at least there was independent India, and that was now gone. British had to rethink its strategy in India, at least according to Britain. The Crown takes direct control from the British East India Company. The British Raj governors govern directly, so that's governors picked by the British. Queen Victoria of Great Britain is now made Empress of India. Less missionaries, more civil service jobs. India became Britain's largest export market, so a lot of trading is being done between India and Britain. India provides Britain with engineers, bureaucrats, soldiers. I mean, there are some positives, but the most important thing is all autonomy and self-control, they are gone because the Indians tried to stand up to the British and they were unsuccessful. You can see the map right here. The dark green is what used to be British controlled in 1805, and here's where the Sepoy Rebellion or revolt took place. After the Sepoy Revolt, all of India is now under British control, and it is under direct British control. Okay, so that is part one. Part two will be the next.